Hello and welcome to Thinkling's Books. My name is Deborah, and today we're going to be discussing what makes a great ending. The typical folk wisdom for writing a great ending is that great endings leave the reader satisfied, but wanting more. And I would say that this folk wisdom is approximately 100% correct. Although I will add that great endings should also always involve an element of twist. Let's go through these. First of all, what makes an ending satisfactory? Well, at its very basic level, a satisfactory ending is simply one that successfully fulfills all its narrative promises. It completes its character arcs, it completes its plot lines sufficiently for the reader to be satisfied. But there is also a specific type of narrative promise that determines what type of ending, happy, tragic, ambiguous, somewhere in between, a book should have to be satisfactory. And this specific narrative promise is simply the tone. Whether the narrative has a tone of hope, a tone of despair, an ambiguous tone, or something in between. Books that have a hopeful tone should always have happy endings. Books that have a despairing tone should always have a tragic ending. Books that have an ambiguous tone should always have an ambiguous ending. And of course, since this is a spectrum, your book can fall anywhere along it. Although I will say that a very high percentage of books do fall solidly into the always despairing and tragic or always hopeful and happy categories. For example, Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is a book with a despairing tone and a tragic ending. The biggest difference between a despairing tone and a hopeful tone is not the content of what's in the book, but the idea of whether or not it is possible to fight the inevitability of fate. In a book with a despairing tone, the feeling is you can't fight it. Somehow it will always end badly. In Wuthering Heights, the characters in the narrative never fight against their circumstances, they always go along with it. The characters again and again and again make the worst possible decision, and they follow their hedonistic impulses, and they follow their feelings, their anger, their rage, and they never stop and exert self-control and say, no, I don't want this to be my fate. I am just going to leave and make a new life and a better life for myself, or I am going to refuse to engage in this bad situation. They never do that. They always just keep making the worst possible situation. And just as in real life, when characters do this, it does not end well for them. But imagine for a second we had the setup of Wuthering Heights, with the characters doing this all the way through, and we got to the climax, and we had this tone of despair, and the writer had said, oh no, I want a happy ending. Actually, I don't exactly have to imagine it, because I have seen this done. And it's done in Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. Great Expectations has a tragic tone all the way through. Characters are miserable, and they keep being miserable, and there is never any impression that the reader gets that they could fight back and improve themselves. No, they're in a bad situation, and there's no way for them to get out of it, so they might as well just accept it. And sure enough, the original ending for the book was tragic. But before the book was published, someone, I think it was his publisher, said to Dickens, you gotta have a happy ending. And so Dickens wrote an alternate end chapter with a happy ending. Except, see, when I read the book, I didn't actually realize the ending was meant to be happy. I mean, yes, the characters, I guess, ended up together. Is that happy? Well, in a book with a hopeful tone, it would have been happy. But in this book, first of all, I don't believe it. And second of all, it doesn't feel happy. Because the tone is so ugly and despairing, and the characters are so hapless, that it just feels miserable, even though it has what looks like a happy ending. On the other end of the spectrum, Can you imagine if a book like Pride and Prejudice ended with, and then everyone was just miserable for the rest of their lives? The end. I would feel so betrayed. I'd be like, are you kidding? This is not what I was promised. I was promised a happy, hopeful little romance, and you give me... What were you thinking? Of course, that's not how it ends. It does have a happy ending, because Jane Austen's a good writer. But it would have just been so inappropriate. It is important to have the right type of ending for your book, but just as important is earning that right type of ending. There is a book, I'm not going to name it, in which the character is in a horrible situation. His father has turned against him. There's a supernatural entity against him. How can he possibly escape? It seems impossible. Well, a character that we met briefly 500 pages earlier shows up and rescues him at the end. They all live happily ever after. That's not a satisfactory ending. And that doesn't fit the aesthetic of hope either, because the aesthetic of hope is that you fight even when the situation is impossible. Not that you will be handily rescued. That's actually closer to the aesthetic of despair, because the aesthetic of despair is you ultimately don't have control over your own life. There are a lot of times I have seen in person people staying in horrible situations because they say, oh, I have no choice. I'm financially dependent. I'm obligated. I'm emotionally tied to this person. I can't give myself a happy ending. Really? Let me tell you a real story. This is a story about a friend of my grandfather's who was a Jew in Nazi Germany, and he was a teenage boy, and his parents set up a secret hidden closet in their house, and they said, if anyone comes knocking, you run, and you get in that closet, and you stay there, and you do not leave no matter what you hear. And someone came knocking, and so he ran to that closet. There was food and water in there, and he stayed in that closet no matter what he heard. He stayed in that closet for 7 days. And when he finally came out, his parents were gone. He was alone, and he had nothing. There's an impossible situation for you. So what does he do? He walks across Europe alone to get to the coast. And at the coast, he convinces a ship to smuggle him to America, along with another Jewish boy who's there. And the captain lets them on board the ship and smuggles them. But before they've reached America, the Nazis catch up with the ship. And the captain says, you two need to jump overboard. Listen, Cuba is 4 miles in that direction. Swim for it. Maybe you'll make it. 4 miles. I don't know about you. I'm actually quite a strong swimmer. I'm not sure I could swim that. In fact, I'm really not sure I could swim that. And so the boys jumped, and they swam. The other boy didn't make it. But my grandfather's friend swam through 4 miles of choppy ocean, and he got to Cuba. And when he got to Cuba, he got a job. But he was basically an indentured servant. They garnished basically the entirety of his wages for his room and board. And so he was surviving, but he was there for years, and he was able to put aside essentially no money. This is an impossible situation. If he leaves, he'll starve, right? He has nothing. He left anyway. He left, and I believe it's at this point that he managed somehow to smuggle himself to America, and he got a new job at a button factory, stringing buttons onto a device. An awful job. He could have just despaired and been like, well, I guess this is my lot, and stay there the rest of his life, like all the other workers in factory. But he didn't. He invented a device to speed up his work by a factor of 4, And this was so strange that the manager came and was like, "You must be cheating somehow. This is physically impossible." And my grandfather's friend showed him the device he'd invented. And the manager took him to the owner, and the owner was like, "This is fabulous, you were promoted." And he eventually became a co-owner of the company. And here's where the story gets a little fuzzy, but since my grandfather knew him, it's also entirely possible that he eventually went on to be a doctor in America, like my grandfather was. The point is, this man was in impossible situation after impossible situation, situations you can't possibly win against, that you will just lose. You might as well just give in to your fate. But he didn't. And because he didn't, he ended happily. He ended up in a wonderful situation. And that is what the aesthetic of hope means. But you have to earn it. You have to fight with it. You can't just bring in a Deus Ex Machina at the end, because that is cheating and that's letting down your reader. I know I've gone on a bit, so let's move on to the next portion, which is books should leave readers wanting more. Now, at a very basic level, this simply means if you write a really good book with a really satisfactory ending, readers will want to read more by the same author. But there's more to it than that. And of course, if this book is part of a series, the book can promise a sequel. It depends what sort of series it is. If it's episodic, it can say, "Hey, want more adventures with my character?" Or if it's basically a book in multiple volumes, like The Lord of the Rings or the Secret Country trilogy, it can say, "Here's the next piece of the story. I have completed smaller character arcs and plot lines for this story to make it satisfactory, but there is more of the story to come." It is, by the way, quite a disservice to your reader to do this if you do not intend to write a sequel. However, this is also not what it means to leave your reader wanting more. What it means to leave your reader wanting more is giving your reader something to take away with them. There are a lot of different ways you can do this. You can, as with the earlier example, say, "Hey, want more adventures with my character? Just think about what sort of hijinks they might get into next." Or you can leave the villain behind. The Haunting of Hill House. The Hill House had stood for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. What might happen in those next 80 years? Will there be another 80 years? What will happen next? Or a book can leave you with a concept to take away with you. As with Hill House, the concept of a house that's born evil and that is lurking and waiting. Now, isn't that an interesting idea to take away with you? Regardless of what sort of thing you give the character to take away, they just need something to really dig their teeth into. To aid both this and satisfaction is the concept of twist. I talked about this a little bit in my video on action. At its very basic level, twist simply means don't make your ending exactly as the reader could have predicted. Don't make it obvious. Have other factors come in. Bring back material from earlier in the book. Have your protagonist come up with an unlikely solution, or have something terrible that totally makes sense in the universe, but that the reader didn't think might happen. Regardless of how you do it, bring in a little creativity, because it will make your reader want more and make them feel satisfied, and also give them that little frisson of delight that comes from an unexpected turn. The folk wisdom is to leave your reader satisfied but wanting more with a twist. But I'd actually like to rephrase this into saying, fulfill your narrative promises appropriately, give your reader something to take away with them, and do it in an unexpected manner. Or to put it another way, your ending should be the inevitable, but not necessarily the expected, outcome of the events and the tone of the book. Thank you so much for joining me for today's video on endings. If you found it at all interesting or informative, please give it a like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to learn of new uploads. Now before I go, I did promise you a little bit more about my book. I could just sit here and tell you about it, but on the whole, I'd rather just read you the beginning in the hopes that it will leave you wanting more. So, here's a clip of that. Prelude. No king can maintain his power long without the consent of his people and the support of his lords. Just because a man puts a crown on his head and stomps around bellowing orders doesn't mean people listen to him. King Emil II of Carina seldom stomped or bellowed, and so had no opportunity to see whether anyone obeyed. His advisers called him sire, and his lords bowed their heads, and it never occurred to him that he might not rule as peaceably for the next decade as he had for the past 2. Chapter 1. Fratricide. Coolly defiant of traffic laws, not to mention common decency, the limo stopped every few feet and then started again, decisive as an errant breeze. Other cars clustered behind it, eager to get away from the lunatic, but making no move to swerve or offend. From my perch on the sill of the second-story window, I didn't hear a single honk. "He's back again," I said. "No, he's stopped." My boss didn't answer immediately. He was bent over the cipher he'd been attacking for days, some dreadful new system devised by Actor to torment our cryptanalysts. My boss, being my boss, thought Christmas had come early. He'd hardly surfaced for air in hours. "Senior Nordfeld," I said. "Senior Nordfeld? Excuse me, please?" My boss blinked up at me, baffled as an Edinburgh emerging from hibernation. "Did you need something?" I grimaced. Let's just say that Prefect Aviar is done pretending to be lost. He blinked again, and the distant concentration snapped into radiant presence. Up he gathered his papers, into scrupulous piles they went. His tie was adjusted in a moment, his cuffs in 2 moments, his hair was smoothed, his mouth wiped. Then back down went his head, and out came his pen, the perfect government employee at work. Until you saw the brightness in his eyes and the focused, ready lines of his back. "Keep your phone with you," he told me without looking over. "If I do not return in 20 minutes, call." We're not supposed to use our phones inside security. Heck, we're not supposed to have phones inside security. "Of course," I said. I was opening my mouth to say more when a knock on the door stopped me. The green-clad messenger on the other side dropped to one knee and covered his temples. "Forgive me, Signor, but Prefect Aviar has come to see me," my boss finished. "Yes, I expected as much. Lead on, messenger. I will come immediately." The messenger flushed and scrambled for words. "Honored Signor," he cried, "forgive me, but the summons is for Miss Cartier." I twitched and said, "You must be joking," before I could stop myself. The messenger kept his eyes assiduously on the threadbare carpet. Very proper, but messengers have ears and brains too. "I mean," I corrected, sounding plaintive to my own ears, "whatever do you want to see me for?" "Dismissed," my boss told the messenger, who bowed the door shut. "How would he even know I exist?" I continued. "You never mentioned me in your emails to his brother. Or did you?" My boss's lips turned down into a deep frown that creased cheeks and chin and neck. He wasn't the sort of man to fidget. Instead, he went statue still, so still you wanted to shake him to make sure he remained alive. Aristocrats are often fed information outside their jurisdiction, simply because people are afraid to refuse them anything, he said finally, ponderously. That he has chosen to meet you instead of me is a reasonable precaution, more reasonable than I would have expected from a man like Lord Winter. "Men like Lord Winter," I said, "are why I carry pepper spray and a personal alarm." But even as I spoke, I was gathering up my handbag and heading out to meet him. Because, you see, People are afraid to refuse prefects anything.